Hello, my name is Patrice Perkins Hooker, and I am the president of the State Bar of Georgia. I am here in conjunction with the National Center for Civil and Human Rights to welcome you to our videos on legends who were engaged in the Selma to Montgomery movement. We hope that you enjoy. I appreciate you taking time to come and talk with us a little bit today about your involvement with the planning and the march on Selma, from Selma to Montgomery. This is the 50th anniversary of that celebration, and I really appreciate you as the leader of that coming and just sharing the story about what happened and preserving that story for future generations.
Happy to.
Okay, so you got started with the planning efforts. How did you do that?
The movement really started with the fact that we suffered so many little small indignities, like people, young white guys coming to your house, maybe 20 years old, and calling you, asking if artist, my mother, or Thomas, my father, was there. And we were taught to respect our elders, and we respected everybody by calling them by their Mr. or Mrs. But they didn't do that. There were other indignities that we suffered every day, and we had no way of really expressing that. We didn't have a framework out of how to handle that. When Bernard Lafayette came to Selma, and Collier Lafayette, Clark now, came to Selma, they began to ask us simple questions like, well, why can't you drink out of this fountain, or why can't you use the bathroom downstairs, or why can't you go to the regular hospital? You know, there was a white hospital, a black hospital. There were like, we could not go to the country club except the caddy. We were basically chattel for the white population there. And to begin to verbalize that was such a threat, because as an individual, you weren't able to confront all of that state and local, and even the federal government just simply looked away at things like that. But when Bernard and Coley came to town and people like them, they began to ask us these questions, and it really sort of gave us a political framework out of how to address those indignities. And it was that personal indignity that we all suffered in many different ways that brought us together as a coherent unit, and that's how the marches started.
Okay. And how old were you when you got started with these efforts?
I was about 15 when Bernard came to town, and he spoke to us, but I wasn't immediately activated. It was such a radical concept that it took time for it to really, but the ideas and the questions he asked really stuck with me, you know, because they were questions that like I had no answer to. I'm the type of person that has an answer to everything, but I could not answer why you're treated like that, and why your parents are being treated like that. But I had an underlying nag about those being indignities, and Bernard gave us a framework out of which to address that. And so about a year and a half later, James Orange, Stokely Carmichael, Ivanhoe Donaldson, Lafayette Cerny, people like that came to town.
And they came from?
They came from
which organization?
They were with SNCC.
SNCC, okay.
Yes. And James Orange came to town. He had originally been a part of the Birmingham movement, and he understood, and James Bevel was there. They understood the benefit of bringing young folks into the movement. One, because we were free to do it and not as threatened as our parents. You know, there were people who lost their jobs and were struck by people who didn't want them to demonstrate. We were being intimidated. I think that as I look back at it, I think that the white power structure had really learned from Birmingham, and without us knowing that, they were determined to suppress us so that we would not act or be activated and bring something about like Birmingham did. But what that really caused to happen is that we were willing to give everything up to address those concerns because they were so human. You know, you could not really face yourself as a person who had self-respect and not really identify with trying to change those things, you know. And so it's all that, it was that vague sense of indignities that brought us together as a community, because everybody suffered. We suffered different indignities, but we all suffered indignities, and that's what brought that movement together. So when there were people coming to organize us, we were ready to get started and go.
And the name of your organization that you chaired was called what?
The Dallas County Youth League. Reverend James Orange organized us, and we met at Brown Chapel Church one afternoon, and we had a certain group of folks there, and we voted. And I learned later that I was voted as being the president of the organization, and I learned 20, 30 years later that they said, well, Charles, we chose you because we knew that you would show up and be responsible, right? And I would, you know, whatever I start, I carry out.
And so your group met for how long before you all actually conducted the march in March?
We started almost immediately, because we met in about November. And
Okay.
The marches started late November, early December. And it was those marches we met, and our first march was we met at First Baptist Church, which is in what we call the projects, which is public housing. And from there, we made our first march downtown, and that was the, and there had been other demonstrations prior to that, but this was the beginning of like the marches that culminated in bringing Dr. King to town, and the nation really began to focus in on what was happening in Selma. And we marched every day, sometime 2 and 3 times a day. You know, the momentum just built and built and built.
So you were marching as a group of students, or
Yes.
students and your parents?
No. Our parents, almost no adults were marching there. James Orange may have been 21, 22. Later on, John Lewis may have been 24, 25. I think John's about 7 years older than me. So it may be 22, 23.
Okay.
But the initial marches were started by students. And it wasn't until later after, and my mother was the first person to register to vote as a result of the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In April of 1969, there was an article done about her. And in that article, what she said, had it not been for the children, we wouldn't have done what we did. So it was really the essence of like what young people can do that really pushed, as it has happened in Ferguson and other places. The youth always come out first, and then they later on attract more mature leadership.
So did you finish high school in Selma?
No, I left Selma in '65 and went to Madison, New Jersey to go to school. I've been actively involved, and there were a lot of people concerned about me being targeted. What happens in movements is that there's a beginning, a middle, and there's sort of a denouement. It sort of drops off, because we had been so actively involved in Dr. King and SCLC. The difference between SCLC and SNCC is that SNCC were grassroots organizers. They actually moved in and stayed there. Dr. King and SCLC, they had other projects to go to. And after the big stuff was over, you know, Bloody Sunday, Turnaround Tuesday, the march to Montgomery, all of that was over. The movement sort of went downhill, and I was a junior at the time, and we spent that whole year out of school. So I went to New Jersey to go to school, because they'd had freedom summers and schools, and you know, I was a fairly smart kid, but you know, didn't apply myself, because under a segregated environment, you don't have a high enough ceiling to want to expand to your best. But the civil rights movement imbued in me a sense of like, you know, I'm somebody and I want to go somewhere. So getting better educated became very important. And I went to New Jersey, 1, because I could go to a better school, and 2, I'd had a better chance of going to a college. And I'd met people. I'd gone with Al Lingo, Charles Allen Lingo, who the state trooper's name was Al Lingo. And Charles Allen Lingo is a white Texan who that Andy had got to organize us and take us up to Vermont to a summer camp. As a matter of fact, Stokely was up there that year and spoke. And from having been up there, I met people who'd gone to school in the Northeast, and I really began to focus primarily on getting better educated. You know, I was very inarticulate at that time. You know, and I did that. I ended up spending although I'd graduated through my junior year because I'd done pretty well. Many other kids were forced to go to summer school because we missed so much time. We took almost a whole year out of school. You know, my junior year was, I doubt if I went to school 3 months. And so I was really, and especially in the Northeast, I was with kids who like had been educated, and the difference between education and intelligence is really one of training. And so I was confronted with people. I'd always been pretty smart, and I was just shocked to find that there were people younger than me who were so much better educated. So I put a lot of effort into catching up. And so I spent an extra year in Madison, New Jersey, where I went to school there and caught up, and was eventually accepted at Boston University. And that's where I went, did my undergraduate work.
And what was your degree in?
I got in political science, you know, thinking that I would go into politics.
And so what did you do after school?
Well, I went to the Harvard Ed School for a year. Wasn't very satisfied with the program. Left the Harvard Ed School and left the country. Traveled to went to Belgium, then to England and Holland and Germany and Switzerland, and Austria and Italy and Greece, and then over to Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan. I worked. I taught English as a foreign language in Afghanistan for about 9 months. Then went to Pakistan and to India, what was Ceylon at the time, now Sri Lanka, and then into the Himalayas, and then back across Europe to Germany, where I stayed for about 2 months and then came back to the States.
Did you go back to Selma?
Yes, as a matter of fact, as I was coming back on the plane, I had to figure out would I go to like California or to New York or Boston, all of which I've become very familiar with, or would I go home? And I hadn't really been home for a long time. And I sort of came back, and it was December, about 23rd or so. The weather was warm. My nephews were around, and so I had a strong sense of family again. So I decided, and plus, you know, Alabama was so backward. I said, you know, this place is like a third world country. If I can't make it here, well, I can't make it anywhere. And you know, I sort of had done the Northeast and traveled half around the world, and like Alabama was like coming back to another third world country. You know.
So how many years later was it that you came back to Selma?
I left when I was 17. I came back when I was about 24, 25.
Okay. So it's about 7 years, 8 years you were gone.
Yes.
And had there been a change in Selma because of what you did before you left?
There was the beginnings of changes. You know, black people were beginning to run for political office. Not very successfully. Maybe 1 or 2 people have been elected. But Selma went into, I think, after the movement, there was a letdown in Selma, and we didn't have, and the white power structure were determined not to give in to black ascendancy, you know, and so they did everything they could to suppress things and to use all types of techniques to try to suppress the vote. Favoritism, benefits, divide and conquer, all types of tactics. And so for a while, didn't too much happen. As a matter of fact, when I came back 1 year, I was in the white theater, and they still would let the white people be downstairs, and black folks had to go upstairs to watch the movie. And one black kid was doing something, maybe they threw popcorn or something downstairs, and some guy came up and started shining a light. Some young white guy came up and started shining the lights in everybody's face, and he started chastising this young kid. I said, you know, you don't have to talk to him like that. He shined the light in my eyes, and then went, and 3 or 4 or 5 policemen came in, which was typical of how that worked at the time. This may have been about 68. And what he had told them is that I had threatened to jump on him and beat him up. And you know, and like what was so startling about this is that like I could look in their face, they had absolutely no questioning about whether he was right or wrong. They just simply took his word. And that had been the pattern of suppressing black folks. You weren't given a reasonable doubt Yeah, if someone white said that you did something, it was automatic. So they took me out and took me down to the jail, and luckily some of the folks who were in the movie, because I was broke, I was in college, came down and bailed me out, you know. But that is the type of situation that was happening directly after the movement. There was really a greater repression, and that type of activity was indicative of that.
What do you think is the main lesson that you learned from your participation in the movement that you think is relevant to tell young people today?
The importance of the power of youth, you know, that people like me weren't extraordinary, we were just ordinary people just like them, and that Cheyenne, I think, was maybe 11 or 12, Joanne was 11 or 12, there were people 13, I was only 16 when I got started, that youth have a great power to change things, as we're seeing now, and that if you have a direction and if you have mature leadership, then you can change the world, as we did.
Okay. What do you think the lessons in Selma have? How do they impact what's happening today in today's world when you're still seeing civil disobedience and nonviolent protests about everything from Ferguson to South Carolina to Trayvon Martin?
I think what is similar about Selma and what happened here is that it was Jimmy Lee Jackson's death and Reverend Reed's death that really caused the momentum that we gained from that, the attention we got. And so tragedies oftentimes activate people to make a move. Young people started it, embarrassed a lot of the older folks to come into it, you know. Mature leadership arose, like Dr. King and James Bevel and Bernard Lafayette and, you know, John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, people like that, Stokely Carmichael, Willie Ricks, Ivanhoe Donaldson. I could go down the whole list of folks. And because we accepted their leadership, because we respected them first, because we respected them, we accepted their leadership. And that leadership took us to where we eventually got to. And it's good for youth to start stuff, but you have to accept mature leadership if you want to succeed.
Mm-hmm. So, if you were looking back on yourself and those early years in Selma, what would you do differently with all the experience that you've gained since then?
Yeah, I would have concentrated more on making myself better prepared at an earlier stage to be more representative of my greatest potential. You know, the reason I can speak to you right now is because when I got to New Jersey, I remember one time I asked him something, and he said, "Well, why did you ask somebody?" You know, that's the way I spoke, and because that's the environment I was in, and I hadn't been around people like Stokely. You know, I thought I was maybe 115 pounds wet, and, you know, I thought I was going to be a football player. I didn't have people like Stokely and John Lewis and people who had gone to Greenwich Village or to D.C. to school or to Memphis or wherever. I didn't have many role models like that, so I really didn't know who I was. And when I met people like that, I began to say, wow, you know, like, these are the type of people I am. You know, I'm not a football player. I'm not a big, you know, lover. I'm just a pretty straightforward person who is pretty self-directed. And when I got that direction, it put me on the right track to travel half around the world independently, and to go to Boston University and get out of there and have the option of staying or leaving Harvard, you know. And it brought out my real inner self. I found out who I was.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your story and your pivotal role in history in making a difference for an entire community and a nation. Because I do believe that it was what the March on Selma did that made the Voting Rights Act possible.
Right.
And so you have been definitely one of those folks who made a difference for the world.
I appreciate your invitation to come here.
I hope you enjoyed this video. I encourage you to get involved and find out more information on the civil rights movement at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Thank you.